Last time we saw that Manstein didn't give the breakout order, merely the instructions for it. We saw that Paulus wanted to break out. He even asked if he could get the order to break out. Well, what was Paulus's interpretation of what was going on? Colonel Adams says that Paulus asked for more information, but that Manstein only gave him vague and inadequate answers, which angered him. So in frustration, Paulus supposedly said this: "How can I make decisions here when I don't know what it looks like outside, what Manstein and the High Command are doing and intending? I only hear the eternal 'hold on', which we have been doing for 4 weeks already and going to the dogs. Certainly it seems that Hott is making hardly any progress. Parts of his 57th Panzer Corps have gone over to the defensive." Colonel Adams sarcastically responded, "Perhaps we can relieve Hott when we break out and thrust towards him, General." And this shows the absurdity of the situation. The breakout was impossible in the circumstances, and it's simply not practical for Paulus to launch it. Yet he gets the blame for not trying, when in reality Manstein was too far away and never gave him the order because he was too far away. And of course, practically every historian emphasizes Hitler's orders to hold on to Stalingrad and Paulus being unwilling to disobey the Führer. William Craig does some pretty impressive mental gymnastics to take the blame off Manstein and place it on the madman. The order from Manstein left Paulus and Schmidt totally depressed. Having hoped to receive permission to combine Winter Storm and Thunderclap into one mighty operation, they had been told that all they could do was attempt a link-up with the rescue force. Once again, salvation had been denied them by Adolf Hitler? But Hitler had nothing to do with it. They couldn't launch a breakout. I mean, they could launch it, but it wouldn't have gotten very far. Yet the historians are so obsessed with this idea that Paulus was weak-willed and unwilling to disobey Hitler, and that Manstein is a living god, that most of them have missed Manstein's lies and the practical reality of the situation, which ruled out the possibility of a breakout. Worse, there's even a suggestion that Paulus should have been relieved by Manstein and replaced with someone willing to conduct the breakout. This is despite the fact that Paulus was willing to conduct the breakout. He just needed fuel, he needed Manstein to be closer than he was, and he needed the breakout order. So I don't think the issue is Paulus or Schmidt. The reality was that Manstein never gave the order because he knew he was not near enough, and that the 6th Army was on its knees. By this time, the army was expending ammunition at twice the rate of its resupply by air, making it impossible to conduct a breakout. The defenders were also short of gasoline and the heavy draft horses necessary to move artillery pieces and supply wagons. Much fuel and ammunition was used up from reserves intended for the thrust, thanks to Soviet attacks. The earliest date for a breakout would be the 22nd of December, provided we have received a sufficient amount of fuel and ammunition by then. And Manstein, who had kept himself well informed of developments within the Kessel and the state of the troops, must have realised that Paulus's men could never have walked, let alone fought, for between 40 and 60 miles through the blizzards and deep frosts. The 6th Army, with fewer than 70 undersupplied tanks, stood no chance of breaking through the 57th Army. And even Manstein quotes Hitler saying this to him on the phone. "I fail to see what you're driving at. Paulus has only enough petrol for 15 to 20 miles at most. He says himself that he can't break out at present." And Zeitzler reported that Hitler said a similar thing to him. "But what exactly do you wish me to do? Paulus can't break out and you know it." Of course, it's somehow Paulus's and Hitler's fault for not going ahead with the breakout, and supposedly Paulus lost his nerve, and you guessed it, it's Madman Hitler time. But the 6th Army was not capable of offensive action, and the 2nd Guards Army was in the way, so there was no chance. The German High Command seemed to have come to the same conclusion themselves at the time, and this is why the code name for the breakout was never issued, even though Manstein pretended that it was. Manstein had not actually given the order, and he could not assure Paulus of success on the part of 57th Panzer Corps. He told Paulus to make immediate preparations to break out, but not to start until ordered. It is, however, clear that Manstein still avoided taking the responsibility for disobeying Hitler. He could not give Paulus a clear lead. Yet Manstein must have known from the start that Paulus, a firm believer in the chain of command, would never have broken out without a formal order from higher command. You see, I think Beaver's interpretation is slightly wrong. Paulus was willing to break out, he just wasn't willing to do so until Manstein was close enough, and the only way to know if Manstein was close enough was for Manstein to tell him and give him the order to break out. The responsibility then is Manstein's, nobody else's. So this really does come down to Manstein trying to avoid taking responsibility and placing the blame on Hitler or Paulus. And by the way, it's not Manstein's fault that he's not closer, and he's also correct for not issuing the breakout order under the circumstances. The issue is that he lied in his memoirs, saying that he gave the order when he didn't, and then blamed Hitler and Paulus for everything instead of just admitting that the Germans had failed. But Manstein couldn't admit that he had failed because that goes against his narrative that he was a great general who was only stopped by madman Hitler and the endless waves of Russian riflemen and tanks. If he had just said that he had failed to get to Stalingrad, then we wouldn't be having this discussion 80 years later. One final thing people might argue is that Manstein perhaps didn't overtly give the breakout order due to Hitler's insistence that the 6th Army should stay where it was. But, they say, he did give a covert breakout order for the breakout in his message, implying that it was Paulus's fault for not going ahead with the covert order. The problem with that interpretation is that Manstein is still too far away, so he wouldn't have issued the breakout covertly or not, as it makes no sense for him to issue the breakout order now. So no covert order was given, and even if it was, maybe it was so covert that Paulus didn't recognise it as an actual order. Sitting here 80 years later, I'm not seeing a covert order, I'm seeing Manstein clarifying what the two breakout operations were. So even if there was a covert order, it's still Manstein's fault for issuing it so covertly that nobody recognised it as an order. Therefore, I don't think any of these pro-Manstein arguments hold up. It makes a lot more sense to just accept the idea that Manstein gave the instructions for the breakout but didn't actually issue the order, and then lied about everything to cover himself, and then blame Hitler and Paulus. The good news is that historians are now recognising the reality of the situation. From the outset, Winter Storm was doomed to failure, more like a demonstration that all had been done to help the trapped 6th Army than an operation with a realistic chance of success. That the trapped army could be saved had been improbable from the outset. After the 18th to 19th of December at the latest, no reasonable figure in authority, except perhaps the poorly informed 6th Army Command, could continue to expect that this might be achieved. Perhaps the only time when the relief attack might have been successful was from the 14th to 16th of December 1942. It's probable that, had Manstein gathered his relief forces quicker, and had he launched the breakout a week earlier, or had launched the relief effort from the Schur, then it probably would have succeeded. But that's alternative history and mere speculation. In reality, Manstein wasn't able to gather the relief forces quick enough and wasn't able to go the distance, and 2nd Guards Army's arrival was the final nail in the coffin. But it's good to see that historians are recognising that by the time you get to the 19th of December, the date Manstein supposedly ordered the breakout, it's far too late. Manstein's efforts in his memoirs to absolve himself from any blame for the fate of the 6th Army are curiously exaggerated as well as unfair on Paulus. It would appear that he suffered from an uneasy conscience, and yet nobody blamed him. But people have blamed Paulus, and people have blamed Hitler because Manstein said it was their fault. And Hitler does take some of the blame for getting them in this mess in the first place, plus he was dealing with a lot of problems at this moment. The entire southern sector of the front was in crisis. 2 Axis Allied armies had collapsed, 1 German army was surrounded and unable to escape, and the remnants of 2 more armies were fighting to stem the tide. Well, this huge gap needed to be filled, and that could only be done with more bodies. So, on the 19th of December 1942, Hitler ordered 200,000 previously exempt men working in the industries to be inducted into the Wehrmacht. 50,000 would be drafted immediately, and the rest would be gradually exchanged in place of older service personnel. Another 200,000 men would be found by replacing them in the workplace with women. Of course, such reinforcements would take months to arrive and would merely make up for the losses already sustained, but at least some effort was going towards plugging the gap. For the German soldiers struggling in winter conditions right now, though, there was no immediate relief. Prospects were looking bleak, but not for their opposition. From the Soviet perspective, things were looking very good. So much so that they even began withdrawing their battered armoured formations from frontline positions. On the 17th of December, for example, the 4th and 16th Tank Corps were withdrawn to the Stavka Reserve. Also by this point, General Voronov had successfully coordinated the southwestern and Voronezh fronts during Operation Little Saturn, and was now transferred to Stalingrad to act as Vasilevsky's deputy. He was ordered to plan the upcoming operation to destroy the 6th Army, Operation Ring. By assigning Voronov this task, this freed up Vasilevsky to concentrate on the outer encirclement front, meaning that each general could concentrate on their own fronts rather than having their attention pulled in 2 different directions. The glance also says that Voronov was an artilleryman, and so by assigning him the task of crushing the pocket, it shows that the Soviets had turned away from the tactic of relying on tanks and infantry to take out the 6th Army as they had done previously. Now they would use copious amounts of artillery to destroy the Germans instead. Still, as the plans were being drawn up, the Soviets attacked the southwestern flank of the encirclement pocket from the 19th to the 23rd of December, focusing roughly on the area that the breakout operation was going to be launched from. Soviet tanks managed to break into Marianovka, although German anti-tank guns and Marders from 3rd Motorized Division took them out. Pogrel's battalion also had to intervene to help throw back another Soviet penetration between the 44th and 376th Infantry Divisions. No ground was lost, but on average, the 6th Army had sustained 450 casualties per day up until the 18th of December. Then, as a result of these attacks, they lost 1,141 men on the 19th and another 800 on the 20th. And yes, these casualties weakened the force allocated for the breakout. German documents make it abundantly clear that all these Soviet actions had some effect on Paulus's decision not to conduct the breakout operation prior to 24th of December. Chuikov also launched an attack in the factory district to try and link up with Ludnikov, who was still cut off from the rest of the 62nd Army. Ludnikov's troops advanced slightly, overcoming 2 German dugouts in hand-to-hand fighting, but were counterattacked by German forces coming from the Commissar House. Their attack therefore stalled, but it was the 95th Rifle Division that caused the most damage. They launched 5 raids on the fuel installations and a few more against the railway line, all under the cover of copious amounts of mortar and artillery fire. Using anti-tank weapons known as ampulomets, their projectiles caused smoke and fire in the German dugouts, helping them take 3 of them. And the 305th Infantry Division, or what was left of it, had previously only had 1,043 combat troops on the 15th of December. In the last few days, they had suffered 741 casualties. And while some of these would have only had minor wounds, and some probably trickled back to the front, it probably meant that the division had less than 500 infantrymen left. They had no choice but to fill the ranks with rear service personnel. But Chuikov's army was also depleted, and between the 12th of November and the 17th of December, Ice had been floating down the Volga, disrupting ferry traffic. For days at a time, nothing could get through, leaving Churikov's men without food or ammunition. It's fair to say that had Paulus not been surrounded, and had they continued to push, it's unlikely that Churikov's 62nd Army would have survived this period, as they would have eaten through their limited ammunition in next to no time. But as it was, Operation Uranus had occurred, 6th Army was surrounded, and wasn't able to attack Churikov at this most delicate time. And then on the 17th of December, the river had more or less frozen solid, enough for a plank bridge to be built across it. Supplies could now come over consistently on foot, something that the 6th Army noted on the 21st when they discovered the bridge. It was now that Churikov himself decided to cross over the Volga for a party to celebrate the anniversary of the founding of the Cheka, which was one of the forerunners of the NKVD. This was the first time Churikov had left the city since he'd changed his headquarters in October. Well, he got very drunk, and on his return journey he accidentally fell through a hole in the ice and nearly died. Luckily for us, he was saved, so I can now update the Churikov almost died counter to 12. And yes, I am still keeping count. Anyway, back outside the city, just after midnight, Hunnersdorf advanced to the northeast and managed to carve a bridgehead across the Myshkova at Vasilyevka. There he met stubborn resistance from elements of 3rd Guards Rifle Division and 2nd Guards Mechanized Corps, and had to report that his own forces weren't capable of continuing the advance. 21 panzers were out of fuel, and he only had 2 weak companies of motorized troops at the bridgehead. More reinforcements were coming up, but things were looking desperate, and of course, this is the moment where General Rouse refers to the Soviets attacking in human waves. No, you have 2 companies and a handful of tanks versus a fresh Guards division and a Guards Mechanized Corps. It's hardly endless waves of men. He also says that the Myshkova was the place that he should have linked up with Paulus and the 6th Army, which is absolutely not the case at all. Again, showing that Rouse's memoirs aren't trustworthy. 17th Panzer Division was also trying to hold a bridgehead at Nizhny Kumsky, while 23rd Panzer barely went anywhere, again thanks to the weakness of the German forces and heavy Soviet resistance. As Bergstrom explains in Black Cross Red Star, the weakened Luftwaffe tried to support the ground troops, but a lot had to turn back because of the Soviet fighters and because of the weather. The Red Army Air Force was now successfully contesting the skies, and Hoth's forces were struggling at the Myshkova without adequate air support. So while some advances had been made, there was, realistically, no way for them to get across this river in the near future. 23rd Panzer Division was still miles behind, and a handful of infantry and tanks weren't going to go the distance. It was going to be a few more days, at least, before they got across the Myshkova. So again, why would Manstein order a breakout at this point, knowing that he can't go any further? Also, on the 20th, the OKW recorded this. The Führer is thinking about abandoning Stalingrad. So he hasn't ruled it out. He isn't being stubborn, like some of the other sources say. He is considering this option. 6th Army, in its present situation, can advance forward a maximum of 30 kilometers during a breakout. Therefore, it should not come out before it is time. Yes, it cannot go further than Buzinovka, which is why Manstein needs to be closer. On the other hand, the Führer firmly holds to the opinion that communications must be established with 6th Army and maintained until it is completely withdrawn from the fighting. So the reason Hitler is objecting to the breakout isn't because he wants to hold on to Stalingrad, it's because he knows that the only way to get the 6th Army out is to link up with it first. So he's not against a breakout, only against a premature one. But in order to avoid making it dependent on only Army Group Hoth, during the penetration, 6th Army should be in a state to advance forward at least 50 kilometers. For this, the Luftwaffe needs to transport no fewer than 300 tons of cargo, which is impossible. However, this record shows that the issue with the breakout idea was the failure of the airlift and the fact that Manstein was miles away. This is confirmed when, on the evening of the 20th of December, Manstein sent a message to Zeitzler at the OKH saying he doubted that the 6th Army could be saved. Breakthrough of 57th Panzer Corps to Stalingrad seems doubtful in view of the constant enemy reinforcements facing it. Now, bearing in mind, at this point he's still asking for the units in the Caucasus to be withdrawn and sent to the Stalingrad area as reinforcements. So within that context, Manstein then suggests that any further delay of a decision will result in catastrophe. He doesn't specify what he means, a breakout decision or an improvement of the airlift decision or a decision to bring up units in the Caucasus. There's many ways to interpret this, but one thing is certain now. He knows he cannot get through to Paulus. So, could Paulus really be expected to get through to him? Clearly not. At 1800 hours on the 20th, Paulus' Chief of Staff, Schmidt, reported to Manstein's Chief of Staff, Schultz, that there had been a build-up of Soviet forces in the breakout area. He also made it clear that a full breakout would take 5 to 6 days to prepare for, so that brings us to the 26th. Otherwise, a lot of wounded and heavy equipment would have to be left behind. Schmidt also said, "But we do plead again for not having to attack prematurely, until there is assurance that HOT on that day can reach the area of Buzinovka. For this reason, a reliable continuity of information about HOT's situation is truly essential." This is pretty clear. But then, a little later, he says this: "For the army, it would therefore be of great importance to learn soon enough in advance whether Donnerschlag is at all being considered, and just when, or if it is to be discarded altogether." Well, hold on. If Manstein had given the breakout order the day before, as he supposedly said he had, why would Schmidt be asking if Thunderclap was even being considered? Clearly, Manstein hadn't given the order, and Schultz, Manstein's Chief of Staff, also confirms this in his response to Schmidt. The Field Marshal believes that 6th Army's initial attack has to begin as soon as possible. Waiting until HOT is near Buzinovka is not feasible. We are fully aware that our own fighting impact can only be limited, which is why the Field Marshal is aiming to get Donnerschlag approved. The struggle for this approval is not yet resolved in spite of our continuous urging. Regardless of the decision regarding Donnerschlag, the Field Marshal is emphasizing the urgency of initiating Wintergivita as early as possible. I will confer with the Field Marshal concerning the intended encircling expansion to the east when Wintergivita begins. Wait, what? We're always told that Wintergivita, Winter Storm, is the relief attack. Yet, that's not what Schultz is saying here. He's saying it hasn't even begun. So, Wintergivita cannot be the ongoing relief attack. It must be the 6th Army's own attack to link up with Manstein. But regardless, this again shows us that Manstein couldn't have issued the breakout order because Schultz says Thunderclap hadn't yet been approved and that the Buzinovka attack hadn't yet begun either. And at no point does he say, "Hey, have you started the attack we ordered you to start yesterday?" He doesn't say that. So again, this casts significant doubt on Manstein's narrative. In his memoirs, Manstein also objected to Schmidt's 6-day preparation idea. He doesn't really give a reason why it wouldn't take 6 days for the 6th Army to prepare for the breakout. He just objects to the idea of it, saying that, well, under the circumstances, the army would have to be quicker than that. The fact is, though, that if we look at Kherson in 1944, it took them much longer than 6 days to prepare for their breakout. They were slowly collapsing their pocket so as to free up troops needed to punch through the Soviet lines. Paulus probably would have had to have done something similar. So to just say he needed to be quicker than that doesn't really work. It took them days to get across the Don, so a few days preparation time is not unreasonable. Schultz's message also confirms to the 6th Army that HOT is not going to reach them. which cast doubt on the relief and breakout operations. And while there was still hope from all parties that they could still break through and rescue Paulus's army, the situation on the flank of Army Group Don was getting worse with every passing moment. On this day, the Chief of Staff of the 3rd Guards Army, Major General Krepenikov, was captured by the Axis and interrogated. He falsely revealed that the plan for Operation Little Saturn, which had already evaporated most of the Italian 8th Army, was to reach Rostov and cut off the Axis formations in the Caucasus. This false information confirmed the Germans' suspicion that this was indeed the goal of Little Saturn, and thus stopping this Soviet offensive would have to take priority, because otherwise all the units in the Caucasus would be cut off and subsequently destroyed. Units would have to be pulled from elsewhere, including the Stalingrad area, which would doom the relief operation. Therefore, time was running out for Paulus and Manstein. And it was running out for the men of the 6th Army too. We survivors can hardly keep going, owing to hunger and weakness. The 8th Army Corps reported that the bread rations, now at 200 grams, 7 ounces per day, would only last until the 23rd of December. But there were some minor miracles of supply. The troops of the 76th Infantry Division were receiving additional rations of 1 chocolate bar and 1 tin of conserves every 3 days. Glucose and vitamin tablets were also being issued to all the men to keep them going, and a small additional ration was supplied to men who were very weak. However, their reserves of flour would run out on the 22nd, leaving them almost entirely reliant on the airlift. So really, it's now or never. Manstein has to pull a miracle and get to Paulus in the next couple of days, or that's it. Would he be able to do it? Let's find out. At the Schur front on the 21st of December 1942, 5th Mechanised Corps managed to thrust 2 mechanised brigades and 2 tank regiments into a gap it carved between the 110th and 111th Panzer Grenadier Regiments and forced the Germans back about 3 kilometres. 11th Panzer Division rallied and counterattacked in the afternoon, retaking some of the ground. But it's clear that the Axis front here was barely holding on. The fighting along the Myshkova River also continued on the 21st of December. Kampfgruppe Hunnersdorf somehow managed to expand its bridgehead at Vasilyevka, although the fighting intensified as the day wore on and prevented further progress. It appears that they managed to surround a battalion from the 3rd Guards Rifled Division, probably more because the Soviet division was overextended rather than due to any local superiority. The bulk of 6th Panzer Division managed to catch up to Hunnersdorf, but both the 6th and 17th Panzer Divisions were fighting on 3 fronts. On either flank, they were engaging Soviet troops, they were also trying to expand their bridgeheads over the Myshkova, and there was a Soviet force in between them that they were putting pressure upon. It took them the whole day, but they did manage to eliminate that Soviet bridgehead. 23rd Panzer Division, though, trailed behind, and the 6th Panzer Division was at 50% strength at this point. The men were totally exhausted by now, and the energy of the attack had dissipated. Manstein sent a report to the High Command saying that this was it. They couldn't advance any further. The relief operation was at an end, and Manstein had admitted as much. Hitler, Zeitzler and Jesenek conferred about the situation, but discussions centred around whether to send the SS Viking Division or the 7th Panzer Division to Hot, as well as the crisis in the Italian sector. And Manstein himself was now spending more time reporting on Army Group B's collapse than the relief attack, showing us how important this crisis had become. Focus was shifting away from Stalingrad at a time when the 6th Army was officially starting to report cases of starvation. Although it's not stated who the first case was, William Craig describes a man from the 576th Infantry Regiment of the 305th Infantry Division who was suffering from exhaustion and was taken to an aid station but died an hour later. This was on the 20th of December, the day before the report about starvation, so it may have been him. Such was the terribleness of the situation that 94th Infantry Division reported that its artillery was now completely immobile and that the infantry were only 20% mobile, suggesting that almost all of its equipment, except maybe their rifles, would be lost in a retreat. It said that huge numbers of its horses were dying on a daily basis from the lack of fodder. This suggests that the amount of horse meat was decreasing as well because the horses were famished. Meanwhile, the fighting continued inside the city. In the early hours, Soviet mortars and artillery blasted the German positions, as they had done routinely in the previous days. The Germans temporarily pulled back as usual to avoid the shells, but it was a ruse. Shortly after it began, the firing stopped and the Soviet storm groups launched into the attack with melee weapons and copious amounts of grenades. Both Ludnikov's 138th and Goryshny's 95th Rifle Divisions captured several buildings and bunkers. They also took a host of equipment and weaponry as the Germans resisted as best they could. 3 counterattacks were repelled, and 6th Army reported that the 305th Infantry Division had suffered heavily, with only 2 battalion commanders left at this point. One man from the 305th Pioneer Battalion wrote home saying that they only had 1 loaf of bread per day for 8 men, and that the horse meat was giving him the runs. He also notes that he hadn't changed his underwear in over a month, so you can do the math for that one. Overnight and into the 22nd, more hand-to-hand combat occurred, with several more German strongpoints falling into Soviet hands. To the relief of the trapped troops, Ludnikov's and Goryshny's rifle divisions finally linked up, forging a 50-meter wide corridor between them along the Volga's western bank. They had been trapped in this pocket since the 11th of November, so were finally freed 41 days later, although the connection currently consisted of just a phone line and there was a lot more work to do. But as this small-scale action was going on the big scale, the crisis of Operation Little Saturn was forcing the German hand. This was the day that Hitler ordered Army Group Don to establish a new defence line running west from the Shur River near Oblivskaya, but by the time he ordered this, the Soviets had already crossed that line. Soviet tanks were now less than 20 kilometers away from the airfield at Tatinskaya, one of the major airfields supplying the 6th Army. Fiebig, now depressed by the situation, had ordered preparations for the airfield to be abandoned, which Richthofen stopped. Instead, he ordered an emergency defence force to be raised from the ground personnel to defend the area around the airfield. So, with the relief operation already stalled, their own lines of communication in jeopardy, and the Soviets racing towards the airfields used to supply the 6th Army, Manstein's priority now was to plug the gap caused by Operation Little Saturn. He said his intention was to resolve the crisis further west first, before restarting the relief operation later. Now, Manstein did offer Hitler some alternatives, saying that he could keep trying to relieve Stalingrad if Hitler could plug the gap with other units, but realistically they all knew that the relief operation had already come to an end at this point, and Manstein said that they had to stop Little Saturn first before continuing with the relief operation, so there really wasn't an alternative. And as this debate was going on, at the Shur, 5th Mechanized Corps attacked again, this time striking Group Zeller and 2nd Battalion of the 685th Regiment, which had been sent to reinforce them. This fighting initiated a withdrawal that would continue overnight, but ultimately forced the Germans back 6 kilometers, which we may as well show now. And again, this shows how tenuous the situation was at the Shur for the Germans. And it was about to be made worse. That evening, due to the collapse of the Italians, Manstein ordered the 48th Panzer Corps to leave the Shur area and head west to save the airfields at Morozovsk and Tatinskaya. So, any hope of relieving Stalingrad from this direction, or even just holding on to the Shur area, evaporated overnight. Coincidentally, the 5th Mechanized Corps was also ordered to fall back across the Cher to rest and refit, which is an interesting decision because if it had pressed its advantage now, it may have actually done some damage. But regardless, it had done its job of stopping any German attempt to get to Stalingrad via the Cher. Of course, German authors like von Mellenthin twisted all this around to say that the 11th Panzer Division stopped 5th Tank Army heading south. Which technically they did, but the primary reason they were at the Cher in the first place was to get to Stalingrad, and they weren't able to even start that thrust because the Soviets had tied them down. David Glantz refers to this as not just a Soviet tactical victory, but an operational and strategic one as well. To the south of Stalingrad, more of 2nd Guards Army's units were entering the line along the Myshkova, with the 49th Guards Rifle Division supporting the 3rd Guards Rifle Division in its fight against the 6th Panzer Division. Kirchner realised that his forces couldn't advance any further now against this opposition, and so he pulled back the 17th Panzer Division from its bridgehead over the Myshkova, and realising that he needed a reserve force, sent the division's panzer elements to the rear behind the 6th Panzer Division. The Germans were still attacking at Vasilevka, doing some damage to the 3rd Guards Rifle Division, but otherwise they were now sat on the defence. And I want to emphasise this. The relief attack had failed before there was any talk of withdrawing the units to plug the gap carved by Operation Little Saturn. This is important because it's tempting to conclude that the only reason the relief attack failed was because they had to pull forces away to deal with the crisis further west. However, that's not true. The relief attack had already failed by this point. That evening, Schultz once again spoke to Schmidt and informed him that the relief force had stalled at Vasilevka. However, he reassured them that they would get going again soon. Of course, that wasn't true, and Schultz probably already knew this. Schmidt replied by stating that more Soviet units were in the way of their escape route, and the decision regarding the breakout still hadn't been made. No order had yet been given, and even if it had, as Paulus had made clear, it would take them days to get the operation going. And Paulus explained that evening that, due to all the difficulties and the Soviets being in the way, a breakout now would be worse than just sitting still. And that assessment is accurate. At this point, the 6th Army's panzers only had 23 to 30% of their needed ammunition. Mortar ammunition was down to 23% as well, and artillery ammunition was at 35%. Clearly, they weren't in any position to attack. If a breakout was going to occur, it should have happened days ago. And it didn't because Manstein was too far away at the time and there weren't enough supplies. By now, it's far too late. And in addition to this, the official German history brings up a very good point, saying that Paulus wasn't being accurately informed of what was happening outside the pocket. Manstein and Schultz were giving them hopeful reports to keep their spirits up, but the result was that Paulus and Schmidt were left in the dark. So if, let's say, the breakout order had been given, and there was only one chance to save the 6th Army, then, because of the false hope and messages, Paulus and Schmidt wouldn't have reacted quick enough because of the false hope given to them by Manstein and Schultz. Regardless though, there wasn't a chance now. Perhaps the messages of false hope were given because they knew that they couldn't get to them? Either way, Manstein was no closer to Stalingrad than the Cher front had been several weeks before. The whole operation was a failure. The only thing left now is to watch the relief forces crumble, which we'll have to do next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.